Hi again, everybody. So in this second part of the About the Course series, we're going to talk a little bit more about content. So what kinds of things are we going to be learning in the course? And this is kind of important to talk about because sometimes students have certain expectations when they sign up for this course on Native Peoples of the Americas. Um, One thing that I've encountered over the years in this course, and this is not, I know it's not malicious and it's not, with bad intentions, but a lot of non Indigenous students, non native students, sign up for this course with this kind of like, ooh, I want to learn all about how people lived way back in the day, and often there's a really strong draw towards learning about ritual activities and that kinds of things. And again, I know this doesn't come from a bad place. Often it's genuine curiosity and it's not with bad intentions, but a lot of that I know is influenced by a couple of things. One of those is Hollywood portrayals of indigenous people, and one of those things is the invisibility in the school curriculum, right? So if there are a lot of schools where they don't really teach anything at all about Indigenous peoples, and that invisibility, or when they do talk about them, they're kind of like in the past, and you hear about them like during early colonization, but then they just poof, kind of disappear. Um, some schools are talking about residential schools, but even then, like it's important to talk about that. But if that's all you learn, you're missing a lot in terms of a lot of things that are important. So I just want to clear that up. It's not that we don't won't talk about anything that's about how people lived before colonization, and but it's not necessarily framed in that kind of Western gaze kind of sense. Okay, I talk about that a bit on page 2 of the course outline, where I clarify that for people. And again, I do that now because in the past I've had students kind of say, oh, this isn't what I signed up for, or this is what I wanted to learn. And I've had a few people complain about that. So I want to be transparent about that from the start. Indigenous people aren't dead. I mean, they're alive and thriving. Yeah, still dealing with a lot of the impacts of hundreds of years of colonization and the destruction that has wreaked on Indigenous societies. But they've always resisted and maintained a lot of things about their culture, and there's a lot of beautiful things to learn. So, as a mostly non-Indigenous person, so a white settler of Western European descent who has some Indigenous lineage, but who is mostly white and who has grown up as a white person. I haven't grown up in, in an Indigenous culture, so it's I'm not the ideal person to teach this course. It should really be an Indigenous person, but our system is set up so that there are a lot of barriers to Indigenous people getting into these teaching positions. So while we're working on that and trying to change that system, I think it's important to still educate our students, most of whom are non-Indigenous, about a lot of these realities. So the way that I choose what's going to go into this course, well, first of all, I talk to Indigenous educators in other places. I read. I've been for 20 years I've been active in learning and going to stuff. So I set up the content based on what I've learned is important to Indigenous scholars and activists when they talk about what they think that non-Indigenous people should know about Indigenous people. And some of that is kind of some of these worldviews and way of seeing the world that refer back to older times that have been transmitted for thousands of years. But a lot of it does have to do with the impacts of colonization on people. So that's, I'm kind of going with what they want people to know about them, right? So I'm trying to, again, like I said, trying to avoid that Western gaze approach that puts people under a microscope. And unfortunately, anthropology has tended to do that. So anthropologists haven't always been very respectful of Indigenous approaches to things. All that said, we'll have some guest speakers, we'll have different things, or you will kind of get to be exposed to some traditional cultural knowledge that is shared by people willingly, because some people like to share these things. But you'll appreciate it better if you understand how that's been affected by centuries of colonization and how people have really had to work hard to maintain these traditions. Okay, so that's kind of my little disclaimer. It's still, I think that you'll get a lot out of this course if you open yourself up to this knowledge. At least I hope you will. So Indigenous voices are centered in this course. So the two textbooks that we have, which I'll talk about in a separate video, they're both by Indigenous authors. Sometimes we'll have some films that you're going to watch on your own. They're all by Indigenous people. We're going to have, so far I've booked 2 Indigenous guest speakers already. I'm hoping to get a third one. And any material, sometimes I'll give you, some of the readings are going to be like online. There's tons of stuff online. They're all things that are recommended by Indigenous educators, activists, knowledge keepers, artists, and whatnot. So some sample topics. What kinds of things are we going to learn about? Well, one of those things, and throughout the semester, we're going to work on making sure that you have the right vocabulary, because you see these terms there up on the screen, people mix them up all the time, but they do not mean the same thing. And so it's important, not just as academics, but if you are a non-Indigenous student, and some of you might be Indigenous, but if you're not an Indigenous student and you kind of don't understand what these words mean, it's important to use them, because that's how you'll show respect. And so there will be some other terms that we'll learn. For example, we'll talk about people's own names for themselves within their nations. So we'll go into more detail on that. And just a quick note, you might be Indigenous, but sometimes maybe you haven't been exposed to things from other nations, because it's impossible to know everything, right? So I'm still hoping that if you're an Indigenous student, you'll still get something out of this course, because we'll really touch on a wide range of things. And some of it you'll already kind of know from your own personal experience. Maybe you're Indigenous from somewhere else in the world and you'll recognize a lot of the stuff, and you'll be able to, if you're willing. You never have to, okay? This applies to all my classes. If there's something that you want to share, you are perfectly welcome to. And even if it goes against what it is we're talking about, or something in the readings, your experience is different as an Indigenous person from here or elsewhere, that's fine, because not all Indigenous people agree with each other, because they're human, and not everybody within any group agrees with each other on everything. So those conversations are important to have. But I also don't want to feel that, like, if you're an Indigenous student, you're not going to be tokenized, and you're not going to be kind of looked at like, oh, well, what do you think of this? Like, it's really up to you when you want to share and how much you want to share, if you want to share at all. Okay, so I just want you to know that. So second kind of sample topic, worldviews and origins of Indigenous people, but from their point of view. I know the official outline says we're supposed to talk about like the whole Bering Strait theory, but that a lot of people see that as problematic. And if we do talk about it, it'll be in comparison to Indigenous people's own stories of where they came from. And, so we will talk about colonization and how these things here, the Indian Act, the residential school system, 60 Scoop, how there are assimilation tactics and they still have effects today. Multi-generational trauma is a big topic. And we'll also sometimes look at specific groups of people within the Indigenous world. So sometimes colonization, impacts all Indigenous people, but it has had specific damaging impacts on women, children, and Two-Spirit people. And we'll talk more about what that means. We'll talk about treaties, because they're important, because these are agreements that people have, and there were treaties between people before European settlers, colonizers ever came. And then there were some after, and then, sometimes people don't realize that some of the things the government quote-unquote gives to Indigenous people is from a treaty agreement. It's not a favor. It's not a gift. It's not, So these are all things that we try to deal with these things to help people kind of get over their preconceptions. And yes, local histories, cultures, and languages. We will kind of learn, and we'll base this by reading or looking at videos that people themselves have made, things they want to share about their own culture. So not stuff about like some non-indigenous filmmaker went and wanted to showcase the specific thing and make it like kind of all exotic. It's really going to come from people themselves. Okay, and resistance movements, past and present. Indigenous people are not passive victims of colonization. They're certainly affected by colonization, but they've always resisted in some ways, back from the very beginning and ongoing until today. And that's really important to know. Revitalization movements, for example, for languages and different kinds of things. And we might not cover all of this like kind of all together because there's a lot, but sometimes you'll be given options within these things on things to explore. It's an anthropology course. So what about anthropology? Well, there's some relevant concepts. I mean, if you're a social science student, you were able to take this course because you already took the intro course, and so some of those concepts are going to come back, such as the ones listed there. But if you didn't take an anthropology course, you'll be okay. Also, one thing that I think is important to address is the criticisms that Indigenous people have of non-Indigenous anthropologists and some of the ways in which the Indigenous people have been disrespected by anthropology. Because, people don't always like to admit this, but anthropology came at the same time as colonialism. So it has sometimes participated in colonization. On the other hand, some anthropologists have spoken out against colonization. So anthropology can be useful, but we have to be careful to kind of do it in a way that respects the needs and desires of Indigenous people. So that's kind of, again, a very, tip of the iceberg glimpse at what we're going to be looking at this semester. But it'll all come clearer. And also, I like to take an approach that's open. So if something happens in the news at some point, something important happens, and I will bring it into the classroom. So I kind of try to leave things up. There's a plan, but I try to leave things open so that we can adjust to what's happening at the time. And if we have like a guest speaker who's available at the last minute or something like that, then we'll bring them in, and then so we'll kind of go with the flow. If you have any questions, don't be shy to reach out.